Okay, this is going to be World War I, Part 7. We just declared war, and I'm going over some reasons why President Wilson did that, called for the declaration of war. And among the causes, and there were many, I've got it down to about three I want to mention. Debts. Foreign, uh, the British and French were deeply in debt to the United States, and if we let them lose, they won't be able to pay the money back. And we'll take a serious economic hit from that. Is that the reason, as was believed 20 years later? No. Is it a reason? I don't think you can cross it off the list. Okay, the next thing is that President Wilson, as I think I mentioned earlier, had been doing some very deep thinking about how we can prevent wars in the future. And he had some ideas that were taking shape in his mind. He went public with them about 9 months later, the following January, in what he called the Program for the Peace of the World. Everybody else called it the 14 Points. He's working on that. He's not out with it yet. But Wilson knows that there will be no opportunity to implement his ideas unless he gets to go to the peace conference, which he assumes will take place after the war is over, and it did. But if we don't go to the war, we won't get invited to the peace conference. So, in order for the United States to be invited to be represented there, and he's already, I'm not sure, but I strongly suspect he's not going to hand this football off to anybody else. He's going to carry it himself. He wants to go. So, got to take us into the war to do that. So that's all one thing in his mind. We make this effort, this sacrifice, this time. We can support a war if it gives us a chance to resolve future conflict short of war. Okay, so there's that. Finally, this would be number 3. By 1917, there really isn't any neutral ground left for us to stand on. We're going to decide the outcome either way. To be neutral means to be so aloof from the conflict that you have no influence on its outcome either way. That just wasn't true anymore in 1917. The Allies are about to be in very serious trouble. If we sit on our hands and be technically neutral, they'll probably go down. So that would not be neutral. Staying out and being, quote, neutral wouldn't be being really neutral. So going in would not be any more decisive than staying out. Why not, given that, why not act to produce the outcome which we find more favorable? So we declared war and entered the war. Now, the next one's a big one, possible essay questions. The war at home. How was the United States economy mobilized for the war? In the big wars we fought in the first half of the 20th century, not just the military, but the economy had to be put on a wartime footing. It had to be organized for peak efficiency, that all the productive capacity that we had should be devoted to support for the war effort, and little or maybe none of it devoted to producing consumer goods for peacetime use. So, over a period of less than a year and a half, the United States economy was centralized as never before. Unfortunately, that had a lasting impact, paving the way for an enormous amount of centralization further down the line. So we'll just take the big stuff first. There was a large number of agencies and so forth that were set up. Most of them were subservient to other ones, but we'll just go to the top. The industrial sector, that's manufacturing, came under the aegis of the War Industries Board, which had actually been set up in 1916 before we entered the war. It was kind of a just-in-case thing. But as of the outset of the war, they were assuming voluntary cooperation. They would just issue some guidelines. Businesses would voluntarily cooperate, but in practice, they didn't. And so every few months, Congress would go back and give the War Industries Board more power and more power and more power, because there wasn't just open, angry resistance. It was just a struggle. The power it had is going to sound very ambitious, might have been necessary, but it existed far more on paper than reality. But by the end of the war, on paper at least, the War Industries Board was running the entire manufacturing sector of the United States economy as if it were one giant company. The head of the War Industries Board was a financier named Bernard Baruch. I'll put his name up there. Baruch typified the heads of any number of these agencies who were referred to informally as dollar-a-year men. Would you work for $1 a year? Okay. To head these things, they didn't get 30-something mid-management business school graduates. They tapped the captains of industry, the very highest level in corporate America. Men for whom no salary the government could afford to pay would be of interest to them. So they're essentially serving voluntarily. They're volunteering their time for a token salary of $1 a year. That part was true. So Bernard Baruch, $1 a year man. Now, among the things the War Industries Board did was to prioritize wartime production, things that could be useful in the war, over civilian production and consumer goods. They wanted standardization. Now, this is only one out of a very vast number, but I'll mention it because he has an odd history. The Screw Thread Commission served the War Industries Board. They wanted to make sure that a nut made by one company would fit on a bolt made by another. And if a company's management should resist this, theoretically, the War Industries Board had the authority to simply take over that manufacturing concern and run it. I don't think that became necessary. All right, agriculture came under the heading of the Food Administration, headed up by a former mining engineer who had made his fortune working in China and devoted the rest of his life to philanthropy and public service projects. His name was Herbert Hoover. He would later be president at a very unfortunate time. Herbert Hoover headed the Food Administration and had the delicate task of persuading farmers to raise more while simultaneously persuading people to eat less. Okay, how do you do that? Now, Hoover has some philosophical baggage. Mr. Hoover had observed that once governments acquire power, even for the best of reasons, they relinquish it very grudgingly. So Hoover just didn't believe in using government power here because the war is going to end, but the government will still have all that power, and he has a problem with that. I would too. So what the Food Administration did was very, very effective. They basically appealed to people's patriotism. They came up with a slogan. See if this doesn't just send chills down your spine. Here's the slogan: food will win the war. Don't laugh. Food routinely wins wars. Well-fed populations and well-fed armies can hang around in a fight a lot longer than hungry people can. Right? Right. So the Food Administration came out with recommendations. These aren't requirements. They're not rules. They're not laws. Nothing like that. But just if you want to help, just if you want to help out, you could abstain from certain foods on certain days of the week. And I don't think there was a food for every day of the week, but there were meatless Tuesdays, or might have been Thursdays, I'm not sure which, and days when you'd go without this or days when you go without that. That was a conservation measure to free up those same food supplies to feed our armies and the allied populations and their armies. Okay, also, you would, if you want to help out, you can grow a victory garden. A victory garden could be a vacant lot, backyard, side yard, front yard, window box, flower pot, anything that'll grow a bean vine can be your victory garden, because every mouthful of food that you raise for yourself is that much food from the commercial farms that can go to support the war effort and feed the troops. So, did people comply? It just about got out of hand. Just think about it. You have 100 million Americans who just wish there was something they could do. They're too old to serve in the military. There's no defense plan around where they can get a job. They just feel like, just wish there was something they could do. And here comes Mr. Hoover. You want to help us out? You can follow some dietary suggestions and raise a victory garden. So this thing assumed a life of its own. There could be a situation where you just get forgetful and somebody observes you eating on the wrong food on the wrong day. Your neighbors are going to, why? What are you, some kind of German sympathizer? So victory gardens sprouted everywhere, and there are probably people who prayed on their knees every night for the Germans to win, got their victory garden going anyway, just to avoid the hassle. So it merges in with a kind of a vigilantism that prospered during that time. Food administration, quite effective. For the farmers, they used price controls. I've now told you all I know. If they had any sense, they would have put price controls on things they want less of. Okay. The labor market. That's industrial labor, farm labor. The war does two things to the supply of labor. It reduced the supply while increasing the demand. Employers couldn't find enough employees. They get to where they'll hire anybody. And this is part of the social change of the war. There were despised minority groups who would not even have been considered for jobs who are being hired. Minorities, people of color, women get an opportunity they would not have had otherwise to prove themselves as good and reliable workers. That's going to leave a lasting impact. So it reduces the supply while increasing the demand. The demand for labor is at an all-time high. Now, what does this do? This puts upward pressure on wages. Wages being the price of labor. And there's also inflation. And the thing is, people were not equipped to understand what's going on here. Wages were rising. Prices were rising faster. Wage increases were real, but they did not, well, I shouldn't use the word real. Well, forget it. They weren't rising as fast as prices were. So real wages, and in economics, something is real if it's been adjusted for inflation. Real wages were actually falling. You're making more, but you can buy less with it. And this puts pressure on unions to strike. Most unions patriotically refrained from striking because other Americans are out there getting shot at in the trenches in northern France, or southern in this case. How can you justify going out on strike when you still get to sleep in your own bed and eat at your own dinner table every night? But the pressure is there, and it's going to break loose after the war is over. Now, to adjust labor disputes or to arbitrate them, Congress set up the War Industries Board. It was a 5-man board, including none other than former President William Howard Taft. And mediators help two sides work out an agreement. Arbitrators are judges. They hear from both sides, and then they make a ruling, and the ruling is a ruling, and it sticks. So the War Industries Board ran up a surprisingly liberal in a good sense, record here. If the issue were workers wanting collective bargaining rights, they'd go along with that. Women wanting equal pay for the same job as men, they go along with that too. So the War Industries Board headed off these disputes, and former President Taft, future Supreme Court Chief Justice Taft, got a snootful of what life is like for working class people. I will come back in part 8.